Hello everyone and welcome to Total Quilter Monthly. My name is Mark Garretts and I'm a National Floriani educator, and we are going to be starting a new series of monthly presentations on Total Quilter. This first one is going to be called Piecing in the Hoop, and we're going to discuss how you can take a traditional paper pieced or foundation piece design and convert it in Total Quilter or My Decorative Quilter for a piece in the hoop design. Now we are going to be using this square in square block that you see on the screen here, but you can use any foundation pieced or paper pieced block that you have the diagram for. And we're going to show you how to take that diagram and convert it to an in the hoop design, and that's the whole point of this month's presentation. So you can see the diagram we're going to be using there on the left hand side, and you can see a picture of the finished block on the right hand side. If you want to use this particular diagram, it will be available in the project download section for your software. Now if you're not familiar with paper piecing or foundation piecing, the way it works with your sewing machine is you would print this pattern out on a piece of paper, and then you would start to put your fabric pieces down following the number sequence that's in the paper pattern. So the one that's number 1 would go down first, and then for the very first stitch line you would actually put down fabric number 2 at the same time. So 1 would be face up, number 2 would be face down. You would sew the seam line, flip number 2 up out of the way, put fabric number 3 down, sew it, etc., on, and you go around in the order that the numbers are in the diagram, and when you're done you end up with a finished piece. Now we're going to simulate that sequence. Instead of doing it in the sewing machine, we're going to be doing it in the hoop, and we're going to be using the embroidery machine to sew our seams for us, and that's the way we convert a foundation piece or paper piece design to an in the hoop design. And we're going to show you when we get to the software here in just a second the step-by-step sequence on how you do that. But the very first thing you need to do is you need to get an image of your foundation piece design. And you can do this if you have the image in a magazine or a book or a pattern. You'll want to scan that or take a picture of it with your digital camera so you have a format that you can load into the software. And the formats that you can use are JPEG, TIFF, PNG, GIF, any what we call raster or bitmap format the software can load in as a backdrop so that we can trace our seam lines over the top of it. So let's go ahead and get started with the software portion of today's lesson. So if you haven't done it already, fire up your quilting software, and you'll want to come up to the top here and click on the new page icon to get a new page. And since I mentioned click, let's talk about mouse clicks for a second. As I'm going through this tutorial, if I want you to click with the mouse, which is a normal left click, I'm just going to say click. If I want you to right click, I will specifically say right click with the mouse. And the first thing I want you to do is get your page set up so it looks kind of like mine. And the way you'll want to do that is come up to the top ruler bar here and hover your mouse over the top. Don't click yet, just position it over the top here. And then right click on the ruler bar, and you'll want to make sure that you are in inches mode, that show grid is checked, that snap to grid is checked, and lastly come down here and click grid settings. What you want to do is set your grid spacing to 1/4 inch, so 0.25 and 0.25 in both the horizontal and the vertical. And where you set your grid major is kind of up to you. I like to have a grid major line every inch, so I set them to 4 and 4. But wherever you set these, it really doesn't matter. But it's nice to have it on an inch boundary. And then you'll want to have your show grid as dashed lines. That's the way I like to use it. And so go ahead and click OK to lock those in. The next thing we want to do is select our thread chart. And the way we do that is come down here to the bottom left-hand corner to the Select Thread Chart icon and left-click it. And what we want to do is select Floriani Cotton. And you'll do that by hovering the mouse over Floriani cotton and clicking to select that. And when you do that, this is what the thread palette of Floriani cotton looks like. Now, the reason I'm having you use Floriani cotton is not because I necessarily want you to actually use this thread when we stitch out the design, but I like it because it's got a very limited thread color palette, and it just allows us to choose a color easier than having to scroll through a whole bunch of colors. So if we had the Floriani normal poly palette down here, it would have over 360 colors in it if we count the variegated colors and the mixed colors. So that's a little hard to find the colors that we want. So this just makes it a little bit easier. So you should now be set up like this. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to load in our backdrop that we scanned in earlier. And the way we do that is with the load backdrop tool, which is right here. So come over here and click on load backdrop. And when you click on it, you're going to get two options if you have total quilter. If you have my decorative quilter, it's just going to go ahead and open up the backdrop. But when you have total quilter, you have two options, backdrop or magic block, and we want to choose backdrop. And when you do that, it's going to default to the built-in images directory in the library that comes with total quilter and my decorative quilter, but we have not probably saved our backdrop here. In fact, I put mine on the desktop, so I'm going to go ahead and open it up here on the desktop. So I'm going to try and find it, and I called it squareandsquare.jpg. So here it is right here. So I'm going to go ahead and open that. And when you do that, it is going to bring in the backdrop. And this is what we are going to trace over the top of in order to create our seam lines so that we can put our fabric down. Now, I'm going to click off it here by clicking my normal select tool so that it's no longer selected. So right now the backdrop is not selected, so it's kind of pasted there in the background. I can't select it or modify it, so if I click on it, so if I click now here, I can't select that backdrop, which is a good thing because we don't want to keep inadvertently selecting it. However, if I do need to select the backdrop at a later time for some reason, like I need to align it or move it or whatever, then I would come back over here to the left, and if I've already loaded in a backdrop, if I click the backdrop tool, then it reselects the backdrop. So let me go ahead and leave it selected here for a second, because you can see when I've got it selected that the actual image of the backdrop includes some white space around the edge of my actual quilt block. So the first thing we need to do is we need to size this image to be the exact size of the quilt block that we need to stitch out or that we want to stitch out. So the good news is that we give you some tools in the software to be able to do that. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that our backdrop is straight. Now this one happened to come in exactly straight, so I'm actually going to rotate it a little bit to simulate what would happen if you didn't scan it or you took your picture a little bit unstraight. So I'm going to click here and, oh, it's not letting me do it. Well, there we go. Okay, so I'm just going to rotate it a little bit, and so this gives you an idea what it would look like if it wasn't exactly square. And actually I've made it pretty exaggerated, not square. So if you want to square it up, line up what we call the horizontal plane of it. So what you do is you right click on it when you have the backdrop selected. So you got to make sure you are in a backdrop mode, and you can tell that pretty much because you're going to have the little black squares and the little rotate icons around it, but the big clue is over here in your properties box. It is going to say backdrop here. So this gives you all your backdrop properties. So I could rotate it here numerically, but I really don't know how much to rotate it since I rotated it. So I don't really know how much it's off kilter here. The good news is, like I said, we give you a tool to straighten everything up, and it's called Define Horizon, and you access it by right clicking on the backdrop here. when you have the backdrop selected. And you'll see here is the tool right here, Define Horizon. So when I click Define Horizon, what that does is gives me the opportunity to line this up to a horizontal plane. So what I'm going to do is take my mouse and click and drag a line that matches something that's horizontal. So I know this top edge of the block here is supposed to be horizontal. So if I start at one edge of it, and I need to be pretty precise when I do this, so I'm going to click right here and drag along that line and line it up real good. Doesn't really matter how long I do it, but the longer you do it, the more accurate it tends to be. So I'm clicking, dragging, I'm still holding down the mouse button. When I let off the mouse button, you can see that it rotates and puts this line horizontal, so now my block is perfectly horizontal. And that is Define Horizon. The next thing you want to do is make sure that the size of this picture matches the exact size of your block. And depending on if you took it with a camera or a scanner, it might be perfect. So if we look over here in the properties box, we can see that the width of this is 7.17 inches by 7.12 inches high. That is actually the dimension of the picture. So it includes this white space out here. It does not represent the actual quilt block, which is in here, and this dotted line is our 1/4 inch seam allowance. So what we want to do is make sure that the actual area of the quilt block is the proper dimension. And again, we would use something we know the dimension of, like we'd measure straight across the quilt block to set the size. And the way we do that is again by right-clicking on the backdrop and selecting Define Scale. And when I do that, now I have to be pretty precise again with this as well. So I'm going to drag across the center here to the actual edge of my quilt block. I'm just going to move my mouse till I get it nice and straight there, and the exact dimension that I want. When I let off the mouse, a little block is going to come up and say, hey, this is 6 inches right now. It's telling me right here it's 6 inches, right here it's saying it's 6 inches, but I can type a new length in here and it will scale the whole thing to match my new length. So if I want to keep this as a 6-inch block, I could leave this alone because it's perfect. But let's say I want to make this a 7-inch block. So in here, I could type in 7 and click OK, and it would now scale it up to 7 inches. Now, one thing you have to be careful of when you do that is that this dimension right in here, this in the original picture, was set to 1/4 inch. When I scale it, it's actually going to be a little bit bigger. So if you want to keep this 1/4 inch, you're going to have to measure a new line. And I'm going to show you a pretty easy way to do that. So that's the first step in getting your backdrop set up. The next thing we want to do is make sure that our backdrop is aligned to our grid, because what we're going to do is start drawing our seam lines along these lines in here, and we want to make sure that we do them nice and precisely. So remember we had snap to grid turned on when we looked at our grid settings, and what that means is anytime we put down a point like the start or end of a stitch line, as long as we are close to an intersection of two grid lines, it's going to snap automatically to that grid line intersection, and it's going to allow us to draw really precise lines even if our picture is not all that precise. Now the way to do that is to be able to see the grid overlaid on top of the backdrop. By default, the backdrop is on top of the grid, but it's easy to change, and the way we do that is come up here to our program preferences, which is this little gear icon here. Click it, and then we're going to go to the View tab right here, the View tab, and you'll see this selection right here, which is Show Backdrop Below the Grid. And right now the backdrop is on top of the grid. So if we check that and click OK, you'll see that the grid is now overlaid on top of the backdrop. And what we want to do is we want to check to make sure that every place that we have lines in our design that are the endpoints of where the pieces of fabric are. So here, 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 for example, every place we have those intersections of points, we want to make sure that we are on the intersection of a grid line. And you can see that it's lined up pretty good. All right. Now, if you need to realign it, when you have the backdrop selected, you see when you have the hand, you can actually move the backdrop around. So now you can see I moved it. I'm no longer on center. I could do an undo to do that, but I'm going to show you another trick you can do to get this perfectly back to center. And that's over here in our backdrop by using the width and the height controls along with the X and the Y. Now the X and the Y, these are brand new. They came in one of the latest updates, and you probably didn't really understand what they were good for, but I'm going to show you now what they're good for. So the X shows us the center of where this is located on the X dimension, which is the horizontal plane, and this is the center of it on the Y plane. Or it's actually not the center, it's actually the starting point of the edge. All right, so you can see that X is minus 3.93 right now because 0 is in the center, and anything to the left goes minus, anything to the right goes plus. And so what we're going to do to find the exact X center is to take our width and divide it by 2. Now I have a little calculator here. You can't see me doing this, but I'm going to take 8.37, which is the value that's in our width, and then divide that by 2, and I get 4.185. Right, 4.185, and I probably can't get to 185, let's see, but I'm going to put in minus 4.185, and it'll probably just give me 18. Let's see, I'm going to press enter, and no, it took a 185, so that's okay, and you can see that this shifted, and I'm going to do the same thing here with the height control, and that's 8.3, and I know I can do that math in my head. I know that half of that is 4.15, and you can see we're pretty close, so I'm just going to change that to 4.15, press enter, or I could press apply, same thing, and you can see now my backdrop is perfectly back in the center. Now that assumes that the center point of your design is centered in your image. If it's not, then you're going to just have to do it visually. If things are not particularly exactly aligned on the points, it is not actually the end of the world, because what we're going to be able to do is we're going to draw this to the intersection of the points, and if it's off the picture a little bit, it won't matter because the actual block will end up being made with precision because we've aligned it to the points of the grid, which is a precision grid. So that's the first step in getting things set up. And I know this took a long time to go through, but it's definitely worth it to get it set up right in the beginning. So we're going to go ahead and leave this as a 7-inch block. And what I want to show you, though, is one other thing. Now, if I select my normal select tool so you can see the 1 a little better here, you can see there's a 1 here in the center. Now, normally, when in a foundation piece block, you would put down the first 2 pieces of fabric. So you'd put down fabric number 1 and fabric number 2, sew the seam line that is common to both of them, then put down fabric number 3 and sew the seam line that's common to it and maybe number 2. This block is a little bit different in that the seam lines are not necessarily common to each other, but you'll understand the sequence based on the block that you're doing. But one other thing that's different about this block than normally is you can see I've got only one number 1, but all the rest of the numbers, there's 2 of them. So there's 2 2s, 2 3s, 2 4s, and 2 5s. The reason is because this piece here and this piece here, say 5 and 5, we can actually put those pieces of fabric down and sew them at the same time because they're so far apart that they won't actually overlap each other when we do the stitching and the flipping. And so we're able to reduce the number of steps by doing a couple pieces at the same time. So we can do this all the way around. I've preloaded a different backdrop, which was a more traditionally done way to do it, more traditionally way of doing it. And here would be number 1, then number 2, then number 3, then number 4, then number 5. So if we use this one, you would put down fabric number 1 and 2 and sew the seam line between 1 and 2, and then you would put down number 3 and sew the seam line between 1 and 3, and then 1 and 4, and then 1 and 5, etc., all the way around. But again, I'm going to go back to our one that we're working with, and this one you would actually put down fabric number 2 and 2 at the same time, and 3 and 3, and it just makes it go a little bit faster. So that's what we're going to do in this example. So we're going to start putting down our stitches now, and before we do that, let me just explain what we're going to be doing. If you were going to be doing this on a piece of paper in the normal sewing machine, you would have this whole design printed out like you see here, so you'd be able to see where all the stitch lines go. When we do this in the hoop, we don't have this printed out, so we're going to simulate that by putting down stitch lines as placement lines showing us where to put our pieces of fabric. So the sequence is going to be that we'll stitch a placement line, and then we'll put our fabric down, and we'll come back and we'll stitch those fabric down with seam lines. We'll flip the fabric out of the way, then we'll put a new set of placement lines for the next pieces of fabric, etc. So we're going to be using our run stitch tool to do all of this today. So our run stitch tool is right here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the run stitch, and I want to get a color to use, and the default's probably going to be this slate blue, which is probably good enough. And it really doesn't matter which colors we use, because we're going to not be putting those colors of thread in the design anyway. In fact, all of the colors we're going to be using in this particular exercise are going to be hidden because they're actually seams. So it really doesn't matter what color we use. But we do need to use 2 different colors and alternate back and forth between them. And the reason for that is that we need the machine to stop between the placement line and the seam lines so that it gives us a chance to put our fabric down. So we're going to use our slate blue for the placement lines, and we'll use charcoal for the seam line. So we're going to again start with the slate blue color. Before I do that, in order to make it easier for you to see the stitches, I'm actually going to take this backdrop and I am going to fade it out so that it's not as bold, so you can more easily see when I put stitches over the top of these lines. The way I do that is, again, I'm going to reselect the backdrop by clicking on my backdrop tool, come over to my backdrop properties, and right here I have a slider where I can lighten it up. So I'm going to move this slider just a little bit past halfway and click apply, and that's going to gray it out and allow me to put my seam lines down over the top, but more importantly allow both me and you to see where I put down the pieces of thread. So I've also turned on 3D so that it's easier for you to see, and I'm going to come back and click my run stitch tool again to reselect it, make sure I'm still in slate blue, and I'm ready to go. So what I'm going to do is start putting down my first set of placement lines, and what I need is a placement line to show me where to put fabric number 1 and also where to put fabric pieces number 2. Remember, we have 2 pieces of fabric. So if I put a stitch line here and a stitch line here, that will show me where to put my first piece of fabric, and it will also show me where to put my second 2 pieces of fabric, because they all go down together in the first step. So I'm going to start right here and click, and I'm going to come over to the opposite end of where I want that stitching to stop and click. Then the way I tell it I'm done putting in that line of stitching is I right click. Now I want to put in this one down here, so I'm going to come down here and start on the right hand side, come over to the left hand side, and I'm going to right click to put that set of stitches in. Again, remembering that I don't have to be super precise with where I put my cursor. As long as I am close to the intersection of the points where I want to be, I'm going to have a nice precision line in there. So this is going to show me where to put down my first pieces of fabric. Now what I need to do is I need to stitch those seam lines in once I get my first two pieces of fabric down. So I'm going to switch colors. So I'm going to switch to gray, and then I'm going to start drawing again. So what I'm going to do is I would have ended my stitching right here. So I'm going to actually start my stitching here by clicking, and then I'm going to come over here and click and right click to lock that one in. I'm going to stitch this one in at the same time. So I'm going to come up here and click, come over here and click, and then right click to lock that one in. So now I've actually got 4 run stitches in. First one's going to show me where to place my pieces of fabric, and then the second one's going to come along and stitch those pieces of fabric down. Now I need to do the intersection between 1 and 3, and certain blocks you would have a more obvious place to put the second line. It would be between 2 and 3. Since this piece goes up against number 1 and not up against number 2, we have to think about it for a little bit. But we're going to be ending up our stitching right here, so I'm going to start my stitching right here, but I'm going to switch back to slate blue, and I'm going to draw this line in. So click and right click. I'm going to come over here and click and right click to lock those lines in. Going to switch back to charcoal. Again, I ended here, so I'm going to come back the other way. I'm going to click here and right click, come over here, click and right click, and I've got now another set of charcoal lines to lock those down. So this will have put down all these pieces of fabric in the center. Now all I need to do is fabric pieces number 4. So it really doesn't matter which one I do first, but again I'm going to switch back to slate blue, and where did I end? Let's see if I can remember where I ended. I think I ended back down here. So to make the head of the machine travel as little bit as possible, I'm going to come down here and start here and click. I'm going to come up here and click, and then I'm going to right click to lock that one in. I'll come up here and click, come down here and click, and right click to lock that one in. So that's going to show us the placement for those pieces. Now I'm going to switch back to charcoal. I'm going to go backwards from where I was, so I'm going to click here and click. Then I'm going to come back down here and click, come back down here and click, and right click to lock those lines in. So now I have those seam lines in. Now again, I ended right here, so I'm going to start right here with slate blue to put in the placement lines for fabric pieces number 5. Right click, left click, and right click. You see how fast this goes? I'm going to go back to charcoal now. I'm going to go back the opposite direction. So I'm going to come here and right click. I'm going to come down here, click, and right click to lock those guys in. And now I actually have all of the seam lines in for my block. Now I have some options. If I want to, I can come back in and I can tack down the edge of this block if I want to. So I have a nice line going around the edge. And I also have the option of coming and putting in a seam allowance line that I can trim my block to. So this line would be optional. It's kind of up to you if you want to do that. Once we have actually sewn these lines in, we actually need to make the machine stop because we need to flip these pieces out of the way before we come and sew the rest of it. So we can sew the rest of these down with slate blue, so let's do that. So let's click slate blue, and let's go ahead and put a line that goes all the way around. So I'm going to come over here to this corner and start, and I'm going to come up here and start, come over here and start, come down here and start, and come back here and right click. Okay, so that puts that one in, and then I'm going to put another one in that's going to be our trim line. So I'm just going to come right out here and just do the same thing again. I'm going to click around, all the way around, and you can see this one is not lined up perfectly, and that's okay. We're going to talk about that here in just a second. I'm going to right click to lock those stitches in, and now all I need to do is save this design. So I would go ahead and save it in the WAF format, which is going to be my master, and then I would save it again in my machine format. So the way I would do that, I would save it originally by clicking the save icon, then I would come here and click File, Save As, and then when I get that dialog, I would change my machine format to the one that I need to stitch out for my machine. So that's how I would save the file, but by now you probably know how to save a file. So let's talk for a second about the stitch lines that I put in and why they don't line up with the actual 1/4 inch seam allowance that was in my design, in my picture. The reason is because remember that we scaled this to be 7 inches. And when we did that, the inner pieces scaled okay. There was no exact measurement you needed to worry about in here because we made the block 7 inches. But this seam allowance was drawn at 1/4 inch. And when we resized it, we actually made it just a little bit bigger because it scaled along with it. So it was a little bit bigger than 1/4 inch. But reason I didn't worry about it was because I knew I had my grid set up to 1/4 inch, and I could easily draw in my 1/4 inch seam allowance around the edge. So if we've made this an 8 inch or a 12 inch block, that seam allowance line that was in the original diagram would have been way outside my 1/4 inch seam, but I could have easily come in here because of using my grid and draw my 1/4 inch seam allowance in. So that completes this tutorial on how to take a block, a normal foundation or paper piece block, scan it, bring it into the software, get it lined up and centered, and then go ahead and stitch it out. Now I'm going to turn off the backdrop, and I do that by clicking this hide backdrop right here so you can see what my stitch lines look like. And even though if I turn it back on, you can see that things don't line up perfectly precise because the drawing wasn't all that precise. When I turn off the backdrop, you can see it didn't matter because again, because of snap to grid, our block that we have done is totally a precise block, and it is going to come out just perfect in the hoop. So that completes this tutorial. Now, before we get into the rest of it, if you wanted to embellish this block like you would for a normal artwork block, there's no way to do it right now unless we want to embellish the whole block. And that's because what we don't have is outlines for the individual pieces because we didn't start with an outline block. So if you wanted to create those, like let's say we wanted to add a texture fill into the center here, we would actually have to create some boundaries for the fills to go into. And the way I would do that is with my artwork tool. So I would come here and I would grab my artwork tool, and then I would draw where my boundaries are. So let's say I wanted to do the 4 triangles on the outer side here, and I wanted to put a texture fill in there. I would then, as the next step, come in here, and it doesn't really matter where I would start. I would come here and click, here and click, here and click, and here and click to draw that triangle, right click to end it, and I would make sure I come over here and click this close icon, this close shape icon, and that closes it up into a perfect rectangle. Right now, I can draw it again over here, or I can just take this one and copy and paste it. And if I do that, I have to actually position it. So it's probably faster because it's only a few points to draw each one. So let's just go ahead and draw them all in. So let me just click here, 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 And I don't even have to really right click. I can come over here and click close, and that will automatically do the equivalent of a right click and a close up the shape. I can repeat that for the next one. So I'm going to start down here. I'll come up here. And again, it really doesn't matter which order I draw these shapes in. I'll do that and do it one more time. So I'm going to do here, 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 and click here, and then again a close to close up the shape. And so you can see over here now in my artwork I have got 3 separate, or actually 4 separate triangles. So what I'm going to do is select all of them. So I'm going to hold down Control and select all of them. And I'm actually going to change their color so that it separates out from this last run. So let's go ahead and choose this wine color to separate them out. And if you want to see what they look like filled, I can turn on the fill here and click apply. So you can see those are my shapes, though I don't necessarily need to fill them. And I'll unfill them by clicking apply. I've got them selected, so if I wanted to, for example, put in a texture fill, I could come here and select a texture like, say, 257 and put that texture in, and you could see it would fill in those shapes. So this is how you can not only take a block and convert it to foundation piecing, but the little extra tip I've given you here is how to take those same shapes in the diagram and trace over the top of them to get artwork so that we can fill it with our texture fills, stippling, whatever we want. So that completes this lesson for both Total Quilter and my decorative quilter. Everything I've shown you here will work the same in both. Next lesson, however, what I'm planning to do is show you how we would do this same block but create it as a variety of different blocks using our AppliQuilt tool. So we'll show you how to do this as well as create all our lines, etc. As an AppliQuilt block as opposed to a traditional piece in the hoop, or what I call a stitch and flip block. So that completes this month's lesson. I want to thank you for watching, and I want to invite you to come back next month when, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about how to do this same block as an AppliQuilt block. And again, thanks for watching. See you next month.